Standing in a captured US Jeep on March the 25th, 1949, the victorious revolutionary leader entered Beijing. Six months later, virtually the whole of China had been conquered. On October the 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong made his way to the gate of heavenly peace. His portrait was already hanging over the main entrance to the Forbidden City in Beijing, once the palace complex of the Chinese emperor. Mao's task now was to proclaim the People's Republic of China. It was 10 o'clock in the morning on a clear but chilly day in autumn. Around 100,000 people witnessed the historic moment.
He said that today the People's Republic of China is born. But what he never said, nor is it written down anywhere, is what he actually felt at that moment. What was going through his head? We have no idea. What impact had all those victims had on him? For decades, he had been surrounded by people fighting and dying, by people who were starving. How do you handle that? You must be able to shut your mind to so much, and it must make you very hard and ruthless.
From now on, 1/5 of mankind lived under Mao's rule.
In 1949, when they first set up the People's Republic, Mao Zedong said lots of things that have been forgotten. But one line he said was not forgotten. He said, "Today we Chinese have stood up. We will never again be humiliated and bullied by the great powers. We take our place as an equal in the family of nations." That was powerful because Chinese had been humiliated for over a century, and now their national pride was back. And all this was connected with Mao and the Communist Party.
Two months later, Mao headed west. First, he was received in Moscow by Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. On his first visit abroad, the great chairman expressed his hope for close cooperation. During the Cold War, Mao took the side of the Big Brother state and evoked the friendship between the two nations. The great chairman expressly thanked Comrade Stalin for his support for the revolution. The Soviet Union was the first country to acknowledge the People's Republic of China, and it did so the very next day after it was proclaimed by Mao Zedong. Thanks to Mao, Stalin could now regard the world's most populous country as part of his sphere of influence. But in return, the Soviet leader expected gratitude for his years of support. The city of world revolution, Stalin stated, was still Moscow. At the official state banquet, the comrade from Beijing was allowed to congratulate the Soviet dictator on his 70th birthday. At the same time, however, he was put in his place. Mao had to wait for weeks before he could sign the planned friendship agreement. It was not until February 1950 that China's new premier and foreign minister Zhou Enlai was able to sign the extensive cooperation agreements. The atmosphere between the two communist dictators, both of whom were present, could not have been frostier. Stalin saw Mao as a rival of equal stature because Mao wanted China to become a world power. In the meantime, another communist autocrat benefited from the situation. In North Korea, Kim Il-sung, who had been installed by Joseph Stalin, had decided to take control of the other half of the divided country. But he needed support if he was to attack South Korea, which was protected by the United Nations. Kim Il-sung skillfully played the two red dictators off against each other.
Basically, he conned each side into believing that its leader stood behind him, so an appropriate agreement now had to be quickly reached. In this way, Kim Il-sung managed to push ahead with his own interest in the two Korean states being unified. Mao was far more interested in capturing Taiwan. So a Korean war didn't really suit him. Nevertheless, when the decision was taken, so-called volunteer units were dispatched. But these units were comprised not only of volunteers, but, to a certain extent, also of demobilized troops. We shouldn't forget that fighting in China continued into the early 50s. So former enemies and bandits, as they were called, from southern China were conscripted to fight in the Korean War instead of being sent to a labor camp.
On June the 25th, 1950, the North Korean People's Army crossed the border separating the two halves of the divided peninsula. For 3 years, the front shifted from one end of Korea to the other. The population suffered tremendous losses. The fighting cost the lives of 3 million civilians. 3 years later, Korea was a wasteland and is still a divided country today. 400,000 Chinese troops were killed in this war. They were sent to the slaughter as human waves. Unit after unit had to advance until the enemy ran out of ammunition. Mao's eldest son, An Ying, was among those who fell. Mao disregarded the losses as insignificant. The fact that his forces had been able to repel American troops was a huge gain in prestige for his regime. At the same time, the Communist Party introduced the reforms it had fought for during the Civil War. Landowners were dispossessed and their land was redistributed. But the measures were to be carried out not by the organs of state, but by the villagers themselves, who were also expected to play an active role in building up the new revolutionary order. But the land reform soon assumed radical aspects.
In the first 5 years, they carried out all sorts of social reforms. Plus, the people targeted as counter-revolutionaries were suppressed, shot or imprisoned or on labor farm. But for the rest of the people, it was great freedom that they'd never seen before.
The show trials which the visitors staged against local landowners were initiated and monitored by work teams from the party. Over the next 3 years, around 1 million landowners and their families fell victim to the terror. Mao welcomed the violence. In the class struggle, he said, certain classes emerge victorious while others are destroyed. That is the course of history. It has been the story of civilization for thousands of years, Mao wrote. His means for unifying China were nationalism, terror, and ideology.
As a rule, Mao used violence as a political instrument to achieve mobilization as well as political goals. In the early 50s in particular, during the Korean War, he launched an important campaign, suppression of the counter-revolution, as it was known. To attain an appropriately high degree of mobilization, he set percentage quotas for executions in the various regions. And here too, various regions really wanted to stand out and increase their quotas. This is certainly one of the facts why Mao Zedong can be made directly responsible for executions and similar crimes.
Within 6 months, more than 700,000 people were executed. At least 1.5 million Chinese disappeared in labor camps. The strategy of terror as an instrument of power for the Communist Party wasn't all that Mao's regime imported from the Soviet Union. Moscow also provided the funds for rebuilding China economically. Under the slogan, "Learn from the Soviet Union," the Great Brother also gave its Chinese comrades training in industry and agriculture. The first Chinese tractor factory did not begin production until 1958. Mao was the great helmsman who was to guide the young nation through the dangerous waters of reconstruction. His word was law, he had critics removed. Mao adopted an autocratic style of government right from the start. Very few dared to contradict him.
They looked at him as the person who knew what to do. The slogan you kept hearing over and over was, when we follow Chairman Mao's instructions, we win. When we don't follow them, we lose. Looking back at their past history, we won the war because we applied Mao's strategy and tactics. And now we'll build the country the same way.
In summer 1953, at the end of the Korean War, the Chinese leadership presented the first 5-year plan in line with the Soviet model. Prisoners from the penal camps were also required to perform forced labor for reconstruction. In addition, step by step, the private economy was to be nationalized, along with Chinese agriculture. Gradually, the land and the means of production in each village were to be nationalized. Mao demanded diligence and contentment. Every official, indeed the entire nation, must constantly remember that China is a great socialist country, yet at the same time, economically, it is a poor, backward country. That is a huge contradiction, and several decades of hard work will be needed, the great chairman wrote, to make our country rich and powerful. He reckoned it would take between 15 and 18 years to build up a socialist economy. Socialist progress was recorded in propaganda style.
By the late 1950s, China had developed well. Economically, progress was being made. In the early days of the People's Republic, average life expectancy was 36. But by the late 50s, it had already risen to 50 or 60. People no longer starved. Although the level was still poor, life for everyone was steadily improving.
The party pushed ahead with all speed in indoctrinating the masses. Meetings and courses took place in all areas of life. The Mao Zedong path was propagated as the model for the successful emancipation of all colonial and semi-colonial countries. Mao seen reviewing a military parade on the Square of Heavenly Peace. By now, the People's Liberation Army was well equipped. It also had a navy and an air force. Along with the Chinese Communist Party and the state apparatus, it was now one of the 3 pillars of the Chinese state, and Mao Zedong was its undisputed ruler. The obligatory propaganda posters of his subjects still showed Mao side by side with Comrade Stalin. But in March 1953, the Stalinist era came to an end. After suffering a stroke, Joseph Stalin died. Mao offered his condolences, but he did not travel to Moscow for the funeral. For him, the dictator's death was a moment of liberation. However, relations with the new Soviet leadership proved even more difficult than those with the vindictive Stalin. Mao emphatically rejected Khrushchev's comprehensive criticism of Stalin. Nor was the great chairman prepared to bow to Stalin's claim to leadership of the socialist bloc. Mao was no longer willing to be seen as the little brother. A rift threatened to divide the socialist world.
He used to say in Chinese, 我是无法无天的. I have neither heaven nor law. As far as nothing can stop me, nothing can control me. But I didn't realize how seriously he meant that.